Fertilizer is plant food. Wrong. Stick around with me and let's have a look a bit deeper as to what houseplant fertilizers and generally fertilizers are. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So yes, hopefully I have grabbed your attention. Some of you might already know this, but somebody might not. So do not think of a fertilizer as plant food, although we all call it plant feed, plant food. Think of it more like multivitamins. By the end of this video, you'll know what plant food or fertilizer truly is, what plants really need, and how to avoid some common mistakes. Think of this as your houseplant fertilizer 101. So I did a video recently, the people that have been around, they know that there was a few upload issues there, but the final video, you can find it here, which is the photosynthesis 101. So if you would like to find out a bit more about photosynthesis before you dive into fertilizers, I will link it at the top and down below. But yes, so hopefully, I'm hoping, most, if not all of us, might know that there are three main elements to most fertilizers. N, P, K. And that's usually how you will see them at the back of the bottles. And it is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. N for nitrogen, P for phosphorus, and K for potassium. And these, going back to some science classes for everybody here, these relate back to the chemical symbols. You remember the chemical charts that we all used to have in school? These relate back to those letters, basically. But what does each one of these three things do? Nitrogen is predominantly used for photosynthesis, amino acids, and generally lush green foliage. This is one that we need to be paying attention to, especially when you're looking at things like houseplants, with by and large, we are growing for their foliage. Phosphorus is used for something called ATP energy transfer, but if you just think of it as something that facilitates energy transfer, that will hopefully make it a bit easier. Don't get stuck down or bogged down on the ATP side of things. It also plays a part in root development and flowering. And potassium is predominantly used for activating enzymes within the plant, water balance, and disease resistance. But most good fertilizers out there these days don't just rely on the standard 3 NPK. Don't get me wrong, there are some that just focus on that. But if you want to go the extra mile and you want to make sure that your plants are getting the best fertilizer out there, it is generally a good idea to get them a fertilizer that provides them with micronutrients. And some of the most important micronutrients and what they do are magnesium, which helps with chlorophyll, calcium, which assists with cell walls, kind of more the structural elements of the actual cells themselves, iron for chlorosis, and then you've got manganese, copper, zinc, boron, and molybdenum. Think of fertilizer, especially the big three that we were talking about before, the NPK, a bit like an orchestra. If one of the elements of that orchestra is missing, things just don't sound right. Or in the terms of plants, things might not be working as well as you might think they are. But how do these elements work within the soil? Or if you're growing things semi-hydroponically, this could also apply to actual nutrients within the water media that you have for a lot of your semi-hydro growing plants. There are nuances to this. If you want a bit more of a deeper dive into the semi-hydro element and things like that are growing in leca or perlite or pon, do let me know and I will do an entirely separate video talking about that a bit more, because that's a whole host of more intricate, nuanced information that you need to know for that one. So predominantly this video will be talking about fertilizer within any kind of soil type growing media, and I'm including things like coco coir here and things like that. So things that you would normally grow your houseplants in that are not semi-hydro. So within soil, there's something that we need to bear in mind, something called cation exchange capacity. I'll break it down. It's called CEC. It's very, very simple. If you think of soil like a sponge, so you know if you're looking at a sponge, like say a kitchen sponge, it's got all these little nooks and crannies and holes. Imagine the soil being similar. Don't think about airy soil, just go with the example that I'm giving for just a second. Just use your imagination. All of those little holes can hold the minerals that are the elements that the plants need. So in this situation, if we're putting fertilizer, that's where all of the NPK would be sitting within, those little kind of gaps within the sponge. And when you have soil that has a lot of these kind of pockets, it has got high cation exchange capacity, which is something that you generally want because then the fertilizer or these elements will be released slowly. If it's got less holes or smaller holes, the sponge that we were talking about before, think more of your cactus soil mixes because of all the sand and everything like that. It holds on to less of those minerals for fertilizer, which is why, and this is hopefully being able to make connections here, why a lot of the times when you are fertilizing things that are like succulents or cacti, which grow in very arid environments, they generally say only fertilize in their growing season and really reduce how much you are fertilizing them, or use a cactus and succulent specific fertilizer where the NPK values, how much of the nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium are within that fertilizer are much, much lower because within their environments, because of the soil structure and because of where they are, they're not very rich in these mineral elements. We also need to be aware when we're talking about nutrients within the soil, you need to also remember that there's a slight difference between how many nutrients are in the soil and how many of those nutrients are actually available to the plant. And there's a fine nuance there that potentially sometimes you might have a lot of nutrients within the soil, but if they're not bioavailable to the plant, you're not going to get what you're hoping to achieve there. The pH of the soil comes into play as well here, because you can get something like iron chlorosis within really alkaline soils. So alkaline, again, just a bit of a refresher for chemistry. So it's the opposite of really, so there's acid and alkaline, two polar ends of the spectrum. So if your soil is more acidic, there's not as much of an issue with iron chlorosis. If your soil is more alkaline, there is more of a chance that you're going to be leading towards iron chlorosis. And now if we think about the tropical plants that we are growing, a lot of the time they are obviously growing in rainforest. Even the ones that are epiphytically growing, there's like nutrient dense environment that they are growing in. Because if you'd imagine even something growing epiphytically on the side of a tree, it is surviving on leaf decaying matter that releases these elements that the plant needs, the food of the plants, even though we know it's not technically food, it's the multivitamins. But if you want to know more about the food, I'm getting off topic here, but if you want to know more about the food, do check out the photosynthesis video that I was talking about before. That is how the plants truly make their food. But the environment that these plants are growing in tends to be very, very high in these elements that they need in order to help them with their food. Let's talk about types of fertilizers. And the two big ones that everybody kind of knows of is organic fertilizers and synthetic fertilizers. Let's talk about organic fertilizers first. This is where you'd be looking at things like your worm casting, worm poo, and things like compost if you're growing in the garden, fish emulsions, seaweed extracts. This is all going to be feeding into that more organic fertilizer, and by and large these tend to be a lot lower in their NPK values because they're not as consistent. Does that make sense? And the reason why I'm saying this is depending on what you are utilizing, it's going to be affected by its surroundings. So let me get more specific. So NPK within worm castings, worm poo, it's going to be highly dependent on what the worms have been eating in order to create that poo, if that makes sense. So one batch of worm castings might be different than another batch of worm castings that's come from somewhere else and a different set of worms. Does that make sense? Organic fertilizers as well tend to be a bit more on the slower release, and they tend to improve the soil microbiome. So all the little elements that make the soil kind of rich and alive are helped with organic fertilizers. And if you think about it, this is generally what the plants would be getting in the rainforest. It'd be the leaf litter, it'd be things like worm castings, all of these things is what they're going to be getting in their natural environment. Now, talking about synthetic fertilizers, and also, now I'm going to say this quickly, and I'm going to hold your hand when I say this, there is no shame in using synthetic, and there is also no shame in using organic fertilizers. It is a personal choice. Both of them have got pros and cons. It's what you decide you want to go with for your plants and what pros and cons you are willing to accept with the fertilizer you decide to use on your houseplants. Now that that's out of the way, synthetic fertilizers tend to be based more on quick-acting salts because they're obviously not created organically. There are something that we are creating in a lab. The NPK ratios are precise and replicable. I think that's a word, but you know what I mean. So one batch of a specific synthetic fertilizer is going to have exactly the same NPK as another batch of the same exact fertilizer because they can control this within a lab. With synthetic fertilizers, there are some risks that you don't get as much with the organic fertilizers, which is they're more prone to salt buildup because they're so quickly available to the plant. The numbers are high as well, so it can kind of build up over time within the soil media. And that way you do get a bit of more of a risk of fertilizer burn. So if you think about this in kind of more specific terms, organic fertilizers is like a slow cooked meal, and synthetic fertilizers tend to be more like an energy drink. How about we talk about some myths and also mistakes when it comes to fertilizing? The first one is over-fertilizing, and it kind of links in quite nicely with what I was just talking about in terms of salt burn. There is such a thing as too much of a good thing. If you keep fertilizing your plants at high volumes, so let me give you an example. If your fertilizer is saying you need to use, say, I'm not going to even use kind of measurements in milliliters, say a teaspoon of fertilizer within whatever water volume you're using, and you decide, you know what, I'm being smart, I want my plants to grow super duper fast, and I'm going to go with 2 teaspoons or 2 tablespoons. That's when you run the risk of potentially causing things like saltburn because you are giving it too much. Let me bring this back into the example that I was using of multivitamins. And specifically, why am I not? I will put up the top which vitamin is related to this. But there is, and you can look this up, there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. So, and I don't know if it's just a vitamin or it's keratin, but there are people that turn orange because they consume too much carrot juice because they know that carrot juice helps with tanning. So too much of a good thing. I think it's also linked to a vitamin. I'll kind of add it at the top there. Similar thing, you don't want to be over-fertilizing your plants. Go with what the bottle says from the manufacturer, or, and this is generally what most people will say, you know what, don't take the risk and be even more cautious with it, and this is what I do, halve that. Half that. So if it says a teaspoon, use half a teaspoon. Don't go the other way around. Granted, when it comes to more organic fertilizers, Because of the way that they act, this is less risky. So if it does say a teaspoon, you should be okay to just use a teaspoon. But again, if you want to be extra cautious, half that as well. Then there is the notion of wrong timing when it comes to fertilizer. Now, this is a hotly debated topic as well, because there's a lot of people that are just like, do not give your plants any fertilizer in the kind of more dormant or kind of slow periods, so thinking autumn and winter. Only do it in spring and summer, which is kind of their growth season. I can only talk from my own personal experience and from other people that I've spoken to as well. We still all find benefit from fertilizing our plants even during that dormant period, but just really pull back on the fertilizer. So I'll give you an example again. So with the teaspoon example that we were talking about before, the fertilizer, if the manufacturer is saying 1 teaspoon for the growing season, and you are being extra cautious and you're using half a teaspoon in the growing season, you can use 1/4 teaspoon in the winter, and that should be fine. Because the one thing that a lot of people do forget is even though you are not seeing growth up top, so you're not seeing more growth happening on your leaves in the winter, a lot of our plants are still actively growing roots in the winter. So if you don't give it that fertilizer, there is a chance that it's not going to be as optimal at growing roots. And what does that mean? Is if it's not grown as many roots as it possibly could over the winter months, when it comes to the growing season where the foliage starts growing, you might get less leaves, deformed leaves, even smaller leaves. So it's a good idea if you can, just a small amount. It doesn't need to be as frequently in the winter as it is in the summer. And I'm saying that I tend to water my plants with a very, very weak solution of fertilizer every time I water them year round. They're fine. But you need to make those decisions for yourself in terms of what you want to do within your plant and your space. Then there's the myth of one size fits all. And this is not true. Just simply not true, because we talked about this before when we were talking about the cation exchange capacity. So we're talking about, the soil mixes that you would have for cacti and succulents versus what you would have for tropical plants. They are not the same. They do not need the same amount of fertilizer. So you do need to adjust those ratios. Then there is the fact that you are thinking just by fertilizing that you're improving the soil quality. Not all fertilizers are created equally. You need to remember that just because it's got high NPK value, it might not be the right thing. You might need a balanced NPK value where the numbers are like, say, 10, 10, 10 or 20, 20, 20. Does that make sense? So that's a balanced NPK ratio. And you usually will get this on the bottles. There's usually a number next to each one of those letters, or it's usually 5, semicolon, I think it's semicolon, 5, semicolon 5, and that's 5, 5, 5. That's a balanced fertilizer. If you see the numbers fluctuate between the NPK values, it means that the manufacturer is preferring one over the other. So for example, with a lot of houseplants, if you get something that's higher on the nitrogen, which is for the foliage growth, that's probably going to be okay still. Balanced fertilizer tends to be a nice safe zone for everybody. Flip side of that is if you've got something like orchids and you want to get blooms on it, you might prefer something that has got a higher phosphorus level because it encourages and it supports the blooms whilst the plant is blooming. But you can get synthetic and organic fertilizers that have also got things that will help the microbiome. Those trace elements that we were talking about before, the magnesiums, the calciums, all of those things will help improve the soil microbiome as well. So just because you're doing a lot of fertilizing doesn't mean that the soil health is as perfect as you think it might be. But you also need to make your own decision in terms of the frequency. So as I said before, I do a weekly, so a week solution every week or every time I water for my plants, and that suits me fine. You might decide that, you know what, I want to do a bigger concentration of fertilizer, but only do it like once a month or once every 2 months. That's fine. Do whatever works for you in your environment, but just be aware of the benefits, kind of what you are gaining by what you're doing and what you are potentially sacrificing. Does that make sense? So potentially if you're fertilizing heavily less frequently, you might get salt buildups happening more frequently within your plants, and you might get some burn that's happening because there's too many minerals at one point within the soil. If you are fertilizing more weekly, yes, you get less of a chance of that happening, but potentially because it's less and more often, you might not get as explosive growth during that big push of the growing season. But you make your own decisions as to what you want to achieve and what you feel comfortable with as well. But let's talk about fertilizer burn, because I know that that's going to come up. With fertilizer burn, how are things that you can kind of improve it or fix it or kind of avoid it? So avoiding is dilution. So remember the 1 teaspoon example that I was giving before? Do half, do a quarter. Less chance that there's going to be fertilizer burn. That's preventative. Fixative of that would be that every so often, like maybe once a month, don't fertilize. Even the people that are fertilizing with every watering, set yourself a reminder once a month, once every 2 months, of just using water and flushing the whole thing through. Not a small drink, flushing it all through. And that will flush some of those kind of unused minerals so you can avoid the salt buildup and the salt burn. So let's look at some examples more specifically. So for instance, if there is a Monstera and you've got a Monstera and it's got those yellow colorations within the leaves, there might be chlorosis that you're dealing with. So then you might need to adjust. You need to see, oh, is it the pH? Is there too much iron within like the trace elements that I'm giving to this plant within its fertilizer? Adjust. Or you might have a peace lily, a spathiphyllum, and you want it to bloom, but you're using a fertilizer that's either balanced or very nitrogen rich and doesn't have as much of a preference towards the phosphorus. That is not helping it. So potentially maybe switching it for a bit to a phosphorus forward fertilizer will help encourage those blooms. And then if you've got a Galathea with crispy edges, if it's not the water, you might want to pump up the potassium level within your fertilizer. So have a fertilizer that has got slightly higher levels of potassium. But coming into some of my final thoughts. Remember what we said, fertilizer is not plant food. Plant food is created through photosynthesis. And again, the video that I mentioned earlier on that I did goes into more detail of this. Fertilizers are there to assist with the photosynthesis. And as I always say, I encourage experimentation and seeing what works for you in your space with your plants. So monitor your plants when you're starting something. See if they're not adjusting well, pull back. So for instance, if you are watering all of your plants weekly, so a week solution every week, but then you see that a few of your plants are maybe struggling or they're getting a bit too much of a mineral buildup, then you're just like, oh, okay, you know what, that plant probably doesn't even need a weekly feeding. It can probably maybe get fed once every 3 months and adjust accordingly. Or vice versa, if it's not doing enough, maybe I need to be fertilizing a bit more heavily and less frequently and adjust it your way. But see, observe, monitor your plants and adjust accordingly. But hopefully that gives you a bit of a quick overview in terms of fertilizers and how they can help with our houseplants. I'm sure I've probably missed a few things. Anybody out there who's like a plant geek like me that wants to chime in and mention a few other things that I have not said, do let us all know down below. Another video that's going to be following this one, might be the week after or the week after that, is another suggestion that came from you all, which is a deeper dive into mycorrhizal fungi and how much of a game changer they can be to your houseplants. So yes, do let me know other things that maybe I've missed out, or even I'm thinking this might end up becoming a bit more of a kind of educational heavy series. So it's photosynthesis and then it's fertilizer and then it's going to be mycorrhizal fungi. So if you've got another option that you want me to kind of talk about, do let me know down below. Any of this surprised you? Let me know as well. I'd be very curious if some of these things that I talked about you weren't aware of. But yes, as always, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.